First of all, there's a lot to unpack here, and a lot is going on in Korean Instagram. My main angle of approach here is as a Black Korean, professional fashion photographer, and visual sociologist living in Seoul since 2002, and likely to never return to the United States. I'm a participant practitioner shooting my way through Korean Instagram as a field insider and did some of the first professional photo work documenting Korean street fashion from back in 2007, and have noticed a growing, powerful conversation about gender norms from back then. When Instagram came online for Korea, it was gasoline on the fire for this and other conversations about identity, representation, and digitality in Korea, and the nature of Korea as the vanguard of hypermodernity itself. Female Instagram models in Korea are pioneering new political economies of posing, picturing, and entrepreneurial femininity, such as found in the Pay model that uses art as semiotic cover to justify risque modeling that challenges the notion of the nice girl, along with models who engage in professional level modeling who work within a space that only a decade ago would have been considered art. Media theorist Larissa Hjorth said of cell phone art in 2008, "One of the dominant features of mobile media is how it further fetishizes the analog by way of its obsession with modes of realism." She also pointed out, camera phone practices as an extension of photography and snapshots are all about performing normalcy. However, because of the distributive and networked logic of mobile phones, one is now left to contextualize these banal shots and render them newsworthy and relevant to the receiver. Back in 2008, Larissa Hjorth lauded the then avant-garde artistic efforts of Seoul-based media artists putting together cell phone-enabled games that utilized GPS technology with cameras mounted on Korean cell phones. In a Korea that had been noticeably ahead of the rest of the world in around 2006, playing mobile games such as Shoot Me If You Can, in which one must shoot the opposing team members with a camera-enabled phone without being shot oneself, and then sending over the results to a referee via MMS. This was a bleeding-edge experiment in digital technocultural change and questioning the location of art in society. But in an era in which that technocultural change has rendered photography, location sharing, and the formation of digitally enabled communities into something completely mundane, it is important to soberly reconsider these questions once again. What does it mean that our digital selves, the residual self-images that we are free to make and reshape, are freely shared, debated, and even monetized? Also, what does it mean that the older question of whether everyday people can engage in visual technocultural practices that can form communities has been answered with a resounding, well, duh? And what does it mean that all of the people engaging in the deployment of their RSI avatars to make art in the forms of fictional characters or stylized pictorials are all women and girls? And given that Korean society has long been one that has vilified and slut-shamed women for their consumptive habits and purported immorality, from bad modern women consumed by petty consumption in the 1920s and 30s to measure in miniskirts in the 1970s, then cyberbullying women for moral transgression in the early 2000s, isn't it interesting and surprising that it is women and girls leading the avant-garde charge to stage digital art that grounds a conversation about identity and gender norms today? Because between the image of the greedy, materialistic bean paste girl and the gold-digging kimchi girl, the consumption and slut-shaming hasn't stopped even today. The inherent intrepidness of these new media digital artists is actually stunning. One has to wonder whether the images constructed on Instagram in 2021 aren't playing with the ideas of media and representation on the same levels as Cindy Sherman, or making sense of the nature of new media itself in the same way that Namjoon Paik did in his once perplexing work with televisions and the assiduously analog content they contained. The answer to the question of whether these Korean Instagram models are indeed artists can be simply addressed by the fact that they are, to the same extent that Cindy Sherman or Nikki S. Lee were, engaged with photography as a medium of self-representation and a mode of engagement with questions of gender, its role norm boundaries, and general social malaise. One could make the argument that these Korean Instagram artists are every bit as significant as the much faded artists from the heyday of Sherman's art in the 1960s or Lee in the 1990s. Korean Instagram models can be considered theater performers of virtual reality. Korean Instagram models now utilize the screen space of Instagram as a kind of dramatic stage within which to enact specific kinds of performances that are engagements with the changing natures of gender, media, and inevitably with the meaning of art itself. Here are just a few of the many possible examples of pictorial, artistic endeavor on Instagram these days, all taken from self-described models, actors, and artists on Korean Instagram in the last few months. Performing the domestic. It occurs to me that part of the fun of this performative beauty practice lies in the blurring of public and private space. Performing the analog. Between the addition of some film grain and the actual inclusion of the edges of the simulated film reel, this image speaks for itself. Does this not itself qualify as a stunning statement on the nature of new media and its relation to the old? The performance of tradition. The hanbok as a traditional nostalgia object is also a highly gendered and culturally fetishized object. Nothing says tradition and cultural purity more than a hanbok, worn almost without exception by a beautiful woman who is usually sited within a traditional structure shot in natural light, usually including a sense of traveling back through time, since contemporaneous objects are usually scrubbed from the scene. Unless, of course, the whole semiotic point of the modern object is to point out the premodernity of the rest of the spectacle. Hashtag home party, or home party. In Korea, there is a new cult of domesticity. This one, though, is centered around the aesthetic of the domestic banal, with an element of the kitsch markers of the American 1950s domesticity cult, amplified by the fact that in Korea, the ability of young people to play at inhabiting these spaces for leisure time pictures is a conspicuous flex and a marker of distinction. As I said at the beginning of this presentation, there is a lot going on with Korean Instagram models, much more than a superficial aping of dominant media tropes and stereotypes. It's my observation that the activities of these highly curated and conceptually advanced models do influence the activity of everyday Korean Instagram civilians, all of which adds up to a decidedly different visual environment in Korea that defines Korean Instagram as a digital sandbox in which the concrete terms and also the theoretical politics of gender are worked out through concerted artistic endeavor.